Welcome to the Tech Law Podcast, where we explore legal issues affecting technology companies, from startups to the giants. If it's tech and it's legal, we talk about it here. The show is presented by Pillar Legal. We help tech leaders protect their companies so they can focus on innovation and growth. Welcome to the show. I'm Greg Pilarowski, your host and founder of Pillar Legal. Today's topic is, do I need to register my out-of-state company in California? We do have a text post with the exact same content. Link will be in the show notes. So if you prefer to read your content as opposed to listening or watching, that's available. Registering an out-of-state company in California. A little bit of background on why this question even comes up. It's a legacy of our federal system here in the United States with two levels of government, more actually, but there's the federal level in Washington and then, of course, the state level at all the different state capitals. Some laws are dealt with at the federal level, some laws are dealt with at the state level. Corporate law, that's state level. So when you incorporate your company, you have to pick a state. And if you're a tech startup, you generally incorporate in Delaware. We have another podcast that talks about why. When you have a Delaware corporation, you're probably not going to have a Delaware headquarters, and your employees are probably not going to be all in Delaware. You'll be operating potentially in multiple states. When you do business in other states, you generally have to register in those other states and pay taxes. If you don't do business in a state, you don't have to register or pay taxes at that state. So this question comes up: when do I need to register in another state if I'm not actually incorporated in that state? Another legacy of the federal system, of course, is that every state gets to set its own standards within the constitutional framework. And so the rules for each state, when you have to register, when you have to pay taxes, are a little bit different. There are some common themes. Generally, if you hire employees in a state, if you have a physical presence in the state, whether that's renting an office or having a warehouse or retail outlets, those things tend to trigger a state's requirement to register with their local corporate registry, often called the Secretary of State, and to pay taxes at the state level. California, similar to other states, and then that physical presence or hiring employees, that will generally trigger the requirements. California, unfortunately, we have two different standards. One standard is for that corporate registration with the Secretary of State, and another standard is for when you have to pay taxes here in California. So two different triggers, which we'll talk about each of them in just a minute. Now, why does this matter? If you don't register when you trigger the requirements to register, so that means you're not filing the paperwork with the California Secretary of State, not paying California taxes when you need to do so, then we'll be subject to fines for not filing. You'll end up owing those taxes anyway, along with penalties and interest. And in the meantime, you won't be able to bring a lawsuit to enforce contracts in the state of California. So can't use the courts here. So it is something that does matter and should be paid attention to. So the first standard: when is it necessary to register your non-California corporation with the California Secretary of State? The corporate standard is when you transact intrastate business in California. And that's defined as repeated and successive transactions wholly within California. So the idea is you're buying and selling inside California, or other types of business entirely in California that's not crossing state lines. So if that happens, then that would trigger an obligation to register here in California. Now, that standard's about as clear as mud. The corporate code does list a number of things that do not require registration with the Secretary of State here in California. That full list is in the text post. A couple of examples: owning shares of a California entity, that in and of itself is not a trigger to have to register here. Participating in litigation, also not a trigger. Soliciting orders that are accepted and fulfilled outside of the state of California, even though the goods are shipped into California, that doesn't trigger the registration requirement either. When is your non-California company subject to taxes in California? So this is the second standard, the tax standard, which is different from that corporate registration standard, just to keep it simple and easy. If you're actively engaged in any transaction for financial gain in California, even without profit, you may have to pay taxes. Similarly, if you have your main office here in California, so if this is kind of your tax home, then you'd have to pay taxes here. And then if you exceed some defined thresholds, which I'll mention in a minute, for your sales, ownership of property, or payroll, if you cross the defined thresholds, then that would trigger tax obligation here in California. Now, what taxes are we talking about? We're talking about income tax on your California sourced income and a minimum franchise tax of $800 a year. That California sourced income tax, the tax rate is 8.84%. Just taxing on California sourced income, not non-California sourced income. So what are those thresholds? If your company sales in California is over 25% of your total sales, or if the property you own in California is over 25% of total property, or if your payroll in California is over 25% of total payroll, that will trigger it. In addition, there's also dollar thresholds. If you cross a particular dollar threshold on sales, property, or payroll, that also triggers registration. Those dollar thresholds are updated every year. For 2024, the sales threshold was $735,000, a little bit north of that. If you have sales in California over $735,000, that would trigger the tax registration and payment in California. If you own property, and this is a low number, $73,500, that triggers registration. Or if you have payroll in California of $73,500, any one of those would trigger the requirement to register with the tax authorities here, pay either that minimum franchise tax or 8.84% on your California sourced income. To make things even more complicated, these rules about registration and payment of California income tax and franchise tax is separate from sales tax. So the obligation to pay sales tax and register to pay sales tax in California is yet another third and separate standard. Is it possible that you hit one of these standards and not the other? Is it possible that you hit a standard to pay taxes in California but don't actually have to register with the Secretary of State? Yes, theoretically possible. However, the reverse is not so possible. If you do register with the California Secretary of State, then for sure you're going to have to pay that franchise tax. Sorry, folks, this is yet another complexity to operating a business in the United States. You may have to register that company in multiple different jurisdictions and deal with not only federal tax returns, but state tax returns in multiple different states. I assure you there are some positive elements to federalism as well, but this is surely one of our negative elements. I hope that's helpful to you. If you have any questions about startups, please shoot them to us, and that can perhaps be the topic of another podcast. Thanks a bunch. The Tech Law Podcast is presented by Pillar Legal. For more information about tech, startup, and video game law, visit our website. Follow us on LinkedIn, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. Links are in the show notes. And now for the legal stuff. We are lawyers, after all. This podcast is for educational purposes only. The information presented in the show should not be construed as legal advice. And listening to the show does not establish an attorney-client relationship. In addition, the information presented has not been updated since the episode publication date. It may be required to be updated or customized for particular facts and circumstances. Any views expressed by guests are not necessarily the views of Pillar Legal. If you need help with any legal matter, be sure to consult an attorney. And if you don't have one, consider contacting us. This podcast episode may be considered attorney advertising under applicable law.